Sometimes a society comes to a historical moment of change, to some kind of crossroads of the choices that have to be made, but the indecision actually indicates confusion rather than clarity of thought as to where we're going and why and how we should. And this topic tonight, from sex at uni to unisex, the context of which I'm speaking is just that. It's the crossroads of confusion. For at the moment, we as a society don't know the way to go in the whole area of sex and of gender. It's not just an Australian problem, it's an international problem for Western confusion. Here's a picture of a man called Jim Lyons, of which I know almost nothing other than he's a representative in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts government. Last month, he moved not one, but 73 amendments to a draft legislation. The legislation was aimed to have a third gender indicated on driver's licences in Massachusetts. So on your licence you'd be either male, female or X. Jim reasoned that if we're going to avoid gender discrimination, then we shouldn't lump all the genders under X, but give an indication of the gender of each person that they may choose. As Facebook has listed 73 different genders, he moved an amendment to include each one. Well, he didn't really. He moved an amendment for each one. Each amendment taking 13 minutes as a minimum. He moved to continue the debate for hours, apart from so much time as to make the legislation impossible. Jim's 73 amendments would have introduced all kinds of things like gender fluid or pangender or polygender. Each amendment he moved such that in the end the Massachusetts legislation decided to just leave their licences with male and female and nothing else. And it's not simply in America, where of course anything and everything is possible, the land of the possible. The problem is filtering down to all kinds of Western society. A couple of months ago, a trainee primary school teacher told me of two classes he attended over here at the University of Sydney. In one class, he and others like him were congratulated that finally some men were preparing to teach primary school. Our schools are in need of men teaching in primary school, and everybody was pleased that the class had some men in it at last. In another class, shortly thereafter, the lecturer asked how many genders were there. The first answer that was given was none, to which the lecturer agreed. Then somebody else called out there were 50, to which everybody agreed, including the lecturer. That is, the number of genders is any number of genders you care to choose, except for two. Why then was anybody pleased that there were men teachers? Why worry about the lack of male teachers in primary school if there is no limit to the number of genders or the kinds of genders that are available? Now, as Cara said, I'm not going to discuss many of the issues that are involved, especially under gender dysphoria and the like. Rob and Claire Smith have done so on this platform previously, and I'm sure you can find out some of their material. And there's all kinds of books on the subject available today. Robert Vaughan has written a book called Transgender. There's a series of essays from England. You'll find it under Noland, who is the editor of it all, called The New Normal. There's a book by Glyn Harrison called God, Sex and Human Flourishing. There's any number of books, Christian books, on the subject, apart from many number of articles in books that are not Christian books on the subject. But here you see an area of social change. And in an arena of social change, you ask the question, how does society change? Well, for all manner of changes happen in society, many without thought or plan, just the consequences of new technologies, some with the deliberate aim to reconstruct society, how we relate to each other and find our place in society. And there are many theories of social change, but as an old geographer, as well as a sociologist, let me use an illustration from fluvial morphology, which is a classic piece of nonsense. What they mean is the shapes of rivers. But fluvial geomorphology sounds so much more educated, doesn't it? You see, rivers normally meander. That's part of the great Amazon. They normally meander unless they're going down a slope. If they're going down a slope, or if they're carrying too much sediment, they don't meander, they braid. But this is the normal pattern of a river. Rivers don't normally travel straight. But it's the meanders I want to remind you of, because Waltzing Matilda happens to be about a billabong. And the technical international term for billabong is an oxbow lake. So, what's this all about? Well, what happens with meanders over time, you see, is that the outside of the curve is worn away by water dumping the sand on the inside of the curve. So the inside grows and the outside grows as the river moves laterally. As this happens, the bridge between one part of the river and another gets thinner and thinner and thinner as it curls around itself, until during an episode, like a flood normally, it breaks through a new path. And so in the third of those pictures that we have there, you see the water is actually going around the old meander as well as going on the new path without the meander. But over time then, the old path gets blocked up, and so you have this, in the fourth one there, a curved box. And so you see there's an oxbow lake. There is a billabong. If it was Australia, actually it's not Australia, so it's an oxbow lake. But we know, root down, it is a billabong, and if we look at the bottom of it, there's a bloke drowned from suicide for stealing sheep. But that is a billabong. It's the cut-off, curved lake beside the river. And this little lake, oxbow lake or billabong, has no water entering it or leaving it. So over time, it actually dries up, leaving just swampy depressions in the ground. And you can see some of the old billabongs in this image there that we saw on earlier, which they no longer got water in them. They're just swampy depressions. Now, there is an image of social change that I'll use for this evening. Very slowly, the banks of society are worn away as society alters in its shape, in such a fashion that when the flood comes, a war, a depression, a tyrant put in charge, a population explosion, there's any number of floods that come upon a society, when this flood comes, the bank gives way and a new culture for society takes over, leaving the old as a backwater, slowly drying up because it has no stream entering it, no real connection with the main stream. And so society just takes a new direction. It's often hard to get the undeniable evidence of that first stage, that gradual social change, that undermining of the pattern. It's hard to collect accurate data, and it's almost impossible to interpret it in a way that everybody will be happy with. It's always possible to reinterpret the data you collect. However, change does happen. One simple piece of information to show you a flood of the 1960s is the change in the percentage of ex-nuptial births, that is, births outside of marriage. So here's a graph I've shown before from the Australian Bureau of Statistics that shows the change from 1910 to 2010. From 1910 to 1970, less than 10% of children were born outside of marriage. But since 1970, it has grown to 35% are born outside of marriage. The American conservative historian Gertrude Himmelfarb, which I just think is a delightful name, you're never forgotten if you've got a name like that, have you? She did a similar graph for the United Kingdom, and she was able to draw the line back to 1800, and there was no variation between 1800 and 1960s. That is, for 160 years prior to the sexual revolution and the change in divorce laws, for 160 years, the variation of children born outside of marriage was between 5% and 8%. But since 1960s, that has risen up to well over 30%. Now, that's a significant and measurable change in culture. Precisely what it is can be debated. Some would see here the growth in single mothers, others would see a growth in de facto marriages. But either way, it's a change. It's a change in the marriage culture, indicating a significant change in our sexual culture. Now, some would see this as a good thing, removing the slavery of marriage and removing the discrimination against bastards. Others would see that this is a bad thing, undermining the stability and sanctity of marriage and of parenting. For some people, you see, all social change is threatening and dangerous and wrong, while others love the idea of change because either they don't like the present or they're idealistic progressives who see all evolution as only ever upwards, positive development for the better. In our society, we can choose our own dream. But remember, just as one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, one's man's dream is another man's nightmare. See, in 1985, the American academic Neil Postman published a very influential book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. I haven't seen it around lately, but if you get a happy chance to read it, I still think it's a worthwhile read, although I haven't read it for 20 years myself. But it's a great read, a very interesting read, and is a very influential book. In the book, he posed the question as to whether George Orwell's book 1984 was accurate or whether Aldous Huxley's Brave New World was a better description of the late 20th century and its future. It's a kind of negative discussion about the future, as both of them are dystopian novels, the opposite of utopian. They're all about how bad things can get. George Orwell's predictions, written just after the World War II, spoke of an authoritarian age where Big Brother watched everything you did and changed the meaning of everything through politically correct language. Aldous Huxley's prediction was written earlier, actually, in 1931, in response to H.G. Wells' kind of optimistic futurism. The Brave New World was a scientific world where people lived in a state of manipulation through conditioning, drugs, technology, in a state of amused happiness. Neil Postman, writing just after 1985, that's why the discussion was there, just after 1984, said that Orwell was the mistake. Huxley was right. The horror of the New World Order was mindless hedonism. But since then, we have had 9/11, and now we have Big Brother watching us in cameras placed all over our cities. In fact, in London, there are 500,000 of these security cameras, which rates at about one for every 20 people. And we have governments and media, both mainstream and social media, imposing politically correct double speech with continued shouting down of debates of different viewpoints. Famous people being disinvited from conferences because they might say things that would upset people. Or I saw that Bettina Arndt the other day was in trouble at a university where she tried to challenge the statistics on the university rape culture and was just shouted down and yelled at throughout the whole of her lecture. And we have the internet companies following our every move and knowing more about us and our habits than we most likely know about ourselves. So which dystopian novel was right, or closer to the mark? 1984 or The Brave New World? Well, the nightmare of the 21st century is, I suspect, that they're both right. It's a double whammy for us, frankly, now. The censorship of language and political correctness that prevents us from speaking openly and plainly what we think, the snooping of Big Brother into our lives, both government and also the whole internet world of big business, the constant pressure to medicate all our problems to keep ourselves happy, the zombie state of mindless pleasure-seeking in an age of instant gratification, I suspect they're both right. Such that today we're facing a new morality, the new morality, as commentators have been calling it ever since World War I may say. For when absolutes are replaced with relativism and any objective morality placed with subjectivism, a new morality replaces the old. The new one is one that is intuitive rather than rational, because there's no consistent accepted rationale. One that is visual rather than literary, tangible and immediate rather than delayed, not reflective or thoughtful or rational, but instant, intuitive. One that rejects all that is old with mantras like, "You're trying to take us back to the 1950s. I'm always amused at, because most people who say it never were in the 1950s. And we're a progressive, secular society, as if that's even vaguely true. One that is government-backed and institution-backed. Education departments, how much they hate all private education, let alone homeschooling. Or universities, and how much you can see the struggle they're having against having an institution on Western culture. How they impose BCE, which is one of the most stupid ideas that have ever come upon us. Instead of BC and AD, we have Common Era and before Common Era, though there never has been a Common Era. And the Common Era they're talking about happens to be identical with the Christian era. I mean, the whole thing is utterly stupid, but is imposed by very clever academics. And then you get Qantas and other big companies taking moral stands. And the content of this new morality is inclusiveness, and therefore has great concern for anybody who is marginalised. We're particularly concerned for the marginalised, so we wind up with a whole new set of pronouns, with political correctness, not of Big Brother, but of pleasure seekers who are rewriting the rules of life, denying the very realities of our existence and thus moving us from sex to unisex. It's necessary to protect democratic minorities, the marginalised. Minorities need protection in democracies to ameliorate the tyranny of the majority. Having spent all my life always only in blue ribbon seats, either on the left or on the right, I have come to accept that my compulsory vote is never worth delivering, though of course I obey the government and do it for fear of fine, but it's never made the slightest difference in all my life. I need to move into a different electorate where there is some possibility that my vote may count. If you're at a minority group, such as the African Americans in North America, you live under the tyranny of the majority. Democracy sounds wonderfully just and right and true if you're in the majority. But if you're in the constitutional minority, there's not much justice, truth or play. And so we need to have a justice system running alongside a democracy. For the majority is not always just and fair, and we want peaceful inclusion of all our citizens. But the law is a blunt instrument that cannot ever cover all the situations of life. So it must be applied equitably by human agents, like judges, taking into account the particular circumstances, especially the particularly unusual circumstances of minority groups. The questionable maxim, hard cases make bad laws, still carries the great germ of truth in it. The law is meant for the generality of the population, and exceptions will have to be made with flexibility. Now, part of the peaceful life of Australia, unlike, for example, the United States of America, has been in our ability to be flexible in administering our laws. Though testing the limits of law and flexibility is part of the political process of social change, where community debate on a range of current issues is asking whether we can include this and this and this. And that kind of debate and discussion in an inflexible society leads to terrible polarisations. Law is not morality. It's government policy with police, guns and prisons. The more it's based in morality, the less it needs police and guns. The more it's based in public opinion and culture, the less need for police and prisons. But the bottom line is that law is government policy rather than morality. It's worse to be immoral than criminal, though being criminal sounds worse than being immoral. And it is worse in that you're not put in prison for being immoral, but you will for being criminal. The problem is that without common morality or culture, the law must rely upon power, and power becomes the basis of social relationships. The power of government, the power of the media, the power of money. Power is the basis when there's no common morality. The power of social media shaming people, the power of business not being supported. Now, I'm not expecting you to agree with everything I've just said under the first heading of this talk. I'm raising the issues. I'm showing that where there's a whole range of different matters that we could discuss, any one of which under the first heading of this talk. Though I think the headings are right issues to be dealing with, our society is at the crossroads. It is very confused, and this is seen in the social change that has happened and is happening. And we do choose, and we need to choose our dream, though it may well be a nightmare. And there is a new morality that is operating now, and democracies and their minorities do need to work out what to do. All those topics are right topics under the heading. What's the right answer to them? Well, I've just shown you the issues. But this is our background as we turn to look at the biblical expectations of life. For our life and times in particular, about social change, about moving from sex at uni to unisex, to understand what the Bible would expect to happen, we've got to understand that this is the context in which we are now reading our Bibles. And as with all these social ethical changes, we need to start at Genesis, firstly with creation. In particular, the creation of humanity in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, where humans are created as one race, one kind, one genus, one kind that is distinct from the animal kinds, having godlike character of caring for the rest of the world. But also, humanity is created as sexually binary, male and female, he created them, in order to be fruitful and multiply, filling the earth as one kind, one humanity, filling the earth in a united harmony. So in chapter 2, verses 18 to 25, the woman is created for the man to be united to the man, so that as one flesh they can start together a new family. This is the prophetic understanding of Genesis account. For when you go to Malachi chapter 2, we're reminded that one God created all of us, and his purpose in making us one, quote, with a portion of the Spirit in our union, was, quote, godly offspring. That is, when God created us, he created us as two to become one in order that they may have one child, two children, three children, who were just an expression, the culmination of the two of them, so that we don't create multiple humanities, we remain one humanity, united together through the sexually binary processes of reproduction. This is the rationale behind Malachi's condemnation of faithlessness in marriage. For the man who doesn't love his wife but divorces her is faithless and violent. Divorce, in this sense, is another form of domestic violence. As the Old Testament starts with the image of unity, in Genesis 1 and 2, it finishes with the image of divorce and violence in Malachi 2. That's because of Genesis chapter 3. For there we have our parents adopting the modern practice of choose your own story. Instead of living in harmony of God's way, they ignore the warning not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Rather, the woman, deceived by Satan into doubting God's word and into doubting God's goodness and into doubting God's integrity, is persuaded that the fruit was good for food, was delightful to the eyes, and was desirable to make her wise. So she chose to eat and gave it to her submissive husband to do the same. Instantly, their eyes are opened. Now they see their nudity and cover themselves with fig leaves. Was this seeing their nudity shame entering into their relationships? For the end of chapter 2 says they were unashamed. Or was it fear that they could now see what they could do to each other and have done by the other? We're not told, but whatever it was, they were right. God clothed them with better clothing than fig leaves. And from this point in the Bible, we see humanity inventing all manner of behaviour that seems wise, though is in fact foolish, that seems right, though in fact is evil, as humanity keeps choosing our own story. Chapter 4 shows us the first polygamist, a man called Lamech. When we go on sometime later to Leviticus in chapter 18, it shows us what the Egyptians and the Canaanites did. And I read, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I'm bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God." He then outlines the Egyptians and the Canaanites' practices. The ones that God finds unacceptable, that God finds actually abominable. These practices, which we know of, they included incest, adultery, child sacrifice, homosexual intercourse, and bestiality. It's a happy little list, isn't it? That's what the Egyptians were doing. That's what the Canaanites were doing. That's what Israel was not to do. It's an interesting case that we have here of such clear establishment of the taboos not to be involved in, which today, of course, are involved in, though child sacrifice is not much these days. But the rest are. The bestiality one, I was interested to see where the atheist Peter Singer was on the panel with a group of people with diverse opinions, and there he was asked and agreed that he actually believed there was nothing immoral with bestiality. The rest of the panel all said, no, that can't be right. They all washed their hands of him. None of them wanted to agree with him. And yet he challenged them to say, well, what is morally wrong with it? And everyone said, I don't like it's creepy. No, that can't be right. Just pure taboo language. None could give him a reason. None offered him a reason. He even challenged one politician and said, but your party is for individual choice and freedom. Wouldn't you be for it? No, it's creepy. I wouldn't go that far. Fascinating, you see. This list, which from the Bible has changed society, has changed society. And though we may have changed away from biblical Christianity, some of this is continuing, but some of it's not. But notice what he says in Leviticus 18, verse 27, towards the end of the chapter. For the people of the land who were before you did all these abominations, so that the land became unclean, lest the land vomit you out when you make it unclean, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. You are not to do these things. So Israel, whose God Yahweh was the creator of all, was to live God's way, Yahweh's way, in opposition and indifference to all the other nations, who were also created by Yahweh and should have lived Yahweh's way, but no, they didn't. They didn't know God's ways. They didn't accept God's ways. And so Israel were to be different. The word for different is holy, separate. As God himself is holy, totally unlike the gods of the Canaanites or the gods of the Egyptians or the gods of the idols of the nations. For even though the nations were created by Yahweh, they didn't acknowledge God and his ways, but following Adam, chose their own ways. But choosing your own story leads to consequences that you don't want. In Genesis 3, it led immediately to the consequences of that choice. Not simply that it was brought awareness of its nakedness, but also because it brought the judgment of God into play. For as God warned in Genesis 2 that the day you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you will surely die, so in chapter 3 he spells out the condemnation of death that we endure in this world today. Cut off from the Garden of Eden, we are now cut off from the tree of life. The path of death takes us through sickness, with all its pain and suffering unevenly distributed amongst us. For our creation is now distorted by death. So some are blind, and some are lame, some are deaf, and others die of cancer. Why, I've even seen some children that were born with cancer. Sickness is normal. Health is abnormal. For death is inevitable and inescapable. Just humour me for a moment or two, my friends, and put your hand up if you've taken any medicines in the last week of any kind at all. Yes, you see, 2/3 of us have taken medicines. Healthiest, wealthiest, attractive, young, youthful-looking people that you've ever seen in the face of the history of mankind, 2/3 of us have taken medicine in the last week. Health is abnormal. Sickness is normal. Our doctors don't always understand this because they think health is normal and sickness is abnormal. They're trying to get people back to health when in fact it's the reverse way around, which is why they always in the end lose and the funeral director comes out on top. But this path of death, that is sickness, that is life, is so unevenly distributed. In particular, this pain of death is experienced by women in their role of reproduction. The condemnation of the man occurs also in his work, but we're not talking about work tonight, we're talking about sex, and the woman in particular has the problem in chapter 3, verse 16 of Genesis. To the woman God said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. This condemnation of a living death brings to the women pain in childbirth and the war of the sexes. And the pain mentioned in 3:16 is more than that of childbirth confinement itself, as painful as that may be, as that is, for it includes the whole range of gynecological difficulties. We don't have andrological hospitals, but we have gynecological hospitals. The problems are much more for women than for men, and they are particularly related to the reproductive processes that women suffer. From period pains to miscarriages, from infertility to stillbirths, there are so many pains that women go through. The world we now live in is the world of death, where people suffer all manner of disease, disfigurement, disabilities and distortions. It's unevenly distributed. You may have a weak heart. You may have a chemical imbalance in your brain. You may have an inability to produce sperm, or you may suffer from polio or diphtheria, or be born with Down syndrome or autism or cerebral palsy. This is the reality of the world, not as God has created it, but as God has condemned it, because of humanity's choice to live our own way in defiance of our Creator. Now, all this is picked up for us in the New Testament, classically in Romans chapter 1, verse 18 to 32. Notice where it starts, explaining our justification by faith in terms of the wrath of God, which is not random or temperamental. That's not the nature of God's wrath. His wrath is an expression of his justice. So verse 18 of Romans chapter 1 reads, "The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who, by their unrighteousness, suppress the truth." Notice several things from this little verse. The wrath of God is against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, not just of Israel, but of all. Secondly, human unrighteousness suppresses the truth. Now, here we pre-modern Christians side with the postmodern thinkers in denying the modernists' objective moral philosophy. There aren't these wonderful human creatures unaffected by their own immorality, sinfulness, or anything else, who just make moral decisions on philosophical truth. That's a figment of their own silly imaginations. Unrighteousness governs human thinking and the acceptance of the truth. Third thing to notice is this suppression of the truth leads to futility in thinking, so that in our wisdom we become fools and worship idols of our own creation instead of the Creator who created us. The angry justice of God is to give us what we want, a punishment that perfectly matches the crime, for it's precisely what we ask for. We want life without God, and so God steps back and gives us life without God. 3 times we read God gave us up. That is, he gave us up to our own choices, which meant he gave us up to our impurity in verse 24. He gives us up to our own dishonourable passions in verse 26. He gives us up to our own debased mind in verse 28. Thus, we not only practiced all manner of actions that distort the purposes of our creation, engaging in all manner of sinful actions, but also we approve those who practice them. For example, the old Egyptian approval of bestiality now finds a modern approval of bestiality in the world-leading bioethicist, that atheist Peter Singer. His book on ethics is the kind of standard textbook used all around the world at universities of the English-speaking world as the basis of understanding ethics today, but he's a man who believes in abortion after birth. Not just late-term abortion, but when the baby comes, it's still all right to kill it. He believes in bestiality, having sex with animals, provided the animal is consensual. I kind of wonder how we know. But consent in sex is one of the difficulties for us to work out with humans, let alone with animals. What is important to notice is that the desire to sin suppresses the truth about the Creator and leads us to other lies and foolishness, as well as ever-increasing immorality, until in the end we approve of that which is evil and disapprove of that which is right. You see it in Romans chapter 8, verses 5 to 7. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. Here it comes. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, For it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. And those who are in the flesh cannot please God. There is a revolution that puts us in total opposition and hostility towards God as we choose to live for this world alone in its fallen, sinful state and in our fallen, sinful state. But notice it's the mind that is affected. We can't think straight anymore. And in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17, we read, "Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do, as the nations do, in the futility of their minds." See where it is? Futility of minds. They're darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to their hardness of heart. They've become callous, given themselves up to sensuality, greedy to practice every kind of impurity. Where does it all start? It starts in the heart. Starts in the motivational basis of us. Starts in our rejection of God. And moves to our way of thinking about everything. Because of our heart's desires, our heart's wishes, our heart's wants, because we're choosing our way of life, then the way we think about the world is based in that. And then our behaviour becomes based in that. And in order to maintain such behaviour, we become greedy for every kind of impurity. For we give ourselves up to the immediate gratification of our sensual practices and become calloused against that which is right. So in these areas of morality, especially sexual morality, Christians are to be different and long to return to the way we were created to live and our Creator's purposes for our creation. Yet we expect that humans will not follow the Creator's desire for them. Even though they're answerable to Him for their actions, even though His ways are the best ways to live, they will claim to be wise, above what is, approving what is evil, but above what God would ever tell us. But they will not only approve what is evil, but they will grow in ever-increasing debauchery. And we expect that the world will be hostile to the Creator's initial creation because we live outside the garden, cut off from the tree of life, suffering the pangs of death, disease and disorder. The answer to all this is the gospel of forgiveness and regeneration, though God doesn't prevent us from total destruction. Though God does prevent us from total destruction by appointing governments to bring some justice. You see, God could have stopped the world in Genesis 3. Or God could have allowed the world to completely destroy itself before Jesus arrived. But God has given us up to do our own thing, but put a fence around us called the government. Now, it's into this context of society facing the crossroads of confusion and of the biblical expectations of sin and condemnation that I offer some hindsight into the mess we currently see in our society under the heading of sex at uni to unisex. It's a long introduction, isn't it? So firstly, a short history of sex, which you can find in the little book that Tony Payne and I wrote, which that's code for Tony Payne wrote, called Pure Sex, written back in 1998 and possibly in need of an update to explain what's happened in the last 20 years. But in chapters 3 and 4 of that book, we outline the way society was constantly being undermined through the 20th century. That the stream was undercutting and shifting further and further in tiny elements, as streams do, but preparing the way for the perfect storm of arrival of the baby boomers at university in the 1960s. The First World War undermined liberal-minded Christianity as civilization destroyed itself with the barbarity of the trenches for the sake of empires. The Second World War restored some faith in morality as it was fought not for empires but for a moral concern to defeat the atheists' eugenic racism of killing the Jews. But all the time, in discipline after discipline at the universities, the old morality derived from Christianity was steadily being undermined by the streams that flowed through there, be it in psychology with Havelock Ellis, or philosophy with Bertrand Russell and Ayn Rand, or anthropology with Margaret Mead, or psychiatry with Sigmund Freud and Wilhelm Reich, or biology with Alfred Kinsey. I mean, in artists and novelists and dramatists and filmmakers, in every endeavour of the humanities, academic leaders, the intellectuals were pulling apart the old Christian morality of sex, of marriage, of monogamous faithfulness. When the lives of these intellectuals are examined, the New Testament analysis is continuously proved to be correct. They were using their cleverness to advocate and defend their own immorality. That's a big subject, but two books that brought it out very clearly to me. One was written by a Roman Catholic called Michael Jones, called Modern Degenerates. His long chapters describing Picasso and his terrible hatred of women that lay behind his cubism is very interesting. But his other references to the degenerates, or an easier to read book in a sense, Paul Johnson's book called Intellectuals, in which he goes through the famous intellectuals of the late 19th into the 20th century, who one after another showed themselves to be total hypocrites in the banner of life by which they lived compared to what they were teaching and preaching themselves. It's a startling book, is Intellectuals by Paul Johnson. Nothing much changed in the lives of society. That is, people continued to be privately sinful, as we always have been and always will be, and people continued to uphold social standards, even if they broke them privately and personally. But as the meander undercuts the riverbank, so society was continuously being undermined. And when in the flood of youth generation arose, who wanted to rebel against their fathers who won the Second World War, the bank collapsed overnight, and Christian morality got left as a billabong on the side of the New River. 2000 on the side of the New River. And fascinatingly, page 19, which is critical to my notes, has disappeared. That's always a worry, isn't it? I wonder what I was going to say on page 19.
Wendy's got it.
Oh, Wendy's got it. Why did you steal my page 19? No, that's not the case. You've got a spare copy. Thank you. Good. Whoa. Okay. Oh, I see. Yes, very important. That is, it's moving from point 3A to 3B, where I'm going to now give you a case study, that is, a short history of Sydney University. My own alma mater, I may say. The university of yesterday is different to the university of today. Prior to World War II, there was only one university in Sydney, and that was it. And it only had a few thousand students, with a much higher proportion of them living in colleges than today. The academics, therefore, were much better known than they are today, for there were so few of them that their positions were of great prestige and importance, not only in the university but in the society as a whole. Today there are professors growing on the tree everywhere, but back then there were only a few professors, and their words really mattered to society. Now, in 1927, a Scottish scholar, John Anderson, came with his wife and family to this very small provincial university as the Professor of Philosophy. He remained there till 1958 in his retirement, nearly 30 years influencing the thought and recruitment of academics for the rest of the country and for the rest of the 20th century. Anderson was an ardent atheist, Originally a communist or communist sympathiser and helper, he gradually became more conservative in his political outlook after the Second World War. He taught generations of students to think, to question, to critique, to test by rationality. His school of philosophy is known as Australian realism, but I won't pursue the details of his arguments. Suffice it to say that he was implacably opposed to Christianity and, in particular, Christian morality. His disciples came to occupy not just the departments of philosophy, but also of psychology and, indeed, all the departments of humanities at the University of Sydney and many other universities. In 2005, his successor, Emeritus Professor David Armstrong, gave an address about John Anderson, and he said, "Anderson, he is arguably the most important philosopher who has worked in Australia. Certainly he was the most important in both the breadth and depth of influence. Among the philosophers who got their original intellectual formation from Anderson were John Passmore, John Mackey, Jim Packer, David Stove and myself, and there are lots more. But for every student who became a philosopher, there were far, far more in the law, in medicine, in journalism, in other academic disciplines that were profoundly influenced by him. I'm inclined to think that, especially in the 30s and 40s of the last century, Anderson was the person who set the agenda and set the tone for intellectual discussion in Sydney." I personally agree with him in that regard, in as much as I've understood the history of the 20th century. Anderson, the Professor of Philosophy at the one university of this city, who was himself such a startling, hard, clear-thinking man, Anderson actually was the person who set the agenda and the tone for the intellectual discussion in Sydney and abroad. But Anderson was not a touchy-feely, relativistic, postmodern man. He was the hard-line, rational man of Enlightenment empiricism, anti-supernatural, anti-Christian, anti-Christian morality. Because he fulfilled the Christian expectations, the biblical expectations. I've always seen him as the great mind, but in reading recently, I've come to discover that just as the Bible told me to expect, he was, of course, using his great mind to rationalise his great sinfulness. You see, he had a student in 1934 in her first year who told him in an essay of her sexual fantasies. In her second year, he invited her to his rooms and talked to her at great length about her essay and other ideas, and started a relationship that ended in a full-blown affair. In her fourth year, surprise, surprise, she got first-class honours in philosophy and won the university medal, and then was appointed to work in the philosophy department for the rest of her life. Ruth Walker was her name, and for many years she was John Anderson's mistress, living in Forest Lodge and lecturing in the philosophy department at the University of Sydney till her retirement. Professor James Franklin, in his book Corrupting the Youth, a fascinating and really worthwhile book to be reading. He's a Roman Catholic mathematician who works at New South Wales University, but he has a wealth, an unbelievable wealth of footnotes. He even apologises for so many footnotes at the beginning of the book, but he says someone needs to have a record of it so that we can follow up the information. And it is astonishing, the work that he has done to produce this book. He writes, "There were naturally some, including herself, who wondered if she'd got there solely through her intellectual merits." Surprise, surprise. A little later he observes, "As to her teaching, some who remember it name her as the worst lecturer they had ever heard. Others believe the competition for that honour is too fierce, but allow that she was a contender." "4 years after arriving, Anderson established and was president of the Free Thought Society, which ran from 1931 to 1951. It wasn't until after he retired that Christians started to see and object to the undermining influence of his teaching at the university. Just slowly, like the outside of the meander, undercutting society. It was Archbishop Gough, not a man that I'm always been in favour of, who famously preached a sermon in 1961 at St Andrew's Cathedral, calling upon action to be taken against the corruption that was taking place at the University of Sydney and naming names. Alas, it was too little, too late, and furthermore poorly thought out and based on faulty evidence, such that Gough became something of a laughingstock in university circles, and the possibility of stopping the rot was well and truly past. But in 1951, Anderson had grown politically conservative, and that led to his decline, to be replaced no longer by the Free Thought Society, but a new society called the Libertarian Society, which gave rise to Anderson's grandchildren taking his philosophy to where he practiced but would never take publicly, in a thing called the Sydney Push. So let's turn to a short history of the Sydney Push. This was an amorphous, ongoing party come pub crawl that ran from the late 1940s, early 50s until the early 1970s. It was a totally debauched lifestyle of clever people arguing at great length about libertarian values while living out with drunken sexual exploitation of each other. There was a core membership who grew in power and stature with the push and could therefore pull younger and younger women into their beds. But there was a constant turnover of lovely young people, bright young talented students who would be intellectuals, entering and leaving to change the world by the libertarian values and ideals that they picked up in the Sydney Push. Some of the famous names of the Sydney Push are now old people. And so when I mention them amongst millennials, they generally say I've never heard of them. But yet they were the people who brought about the 60s revolution that is still with us. And some of them are still with us and still pushing things. So in the passing parade of the Sydney Push, there were Germaine Greer and Clive James, Robert Hughes, Eva Cox, Frank Morehouse, Lillian Roxon, Paddy McGuinness, Wendy Bacon, all these people who were at the forefront of the social changes of the 1970s, 80s, 90s of our society were Sydney Push. These were the movers and shakers of our society and of the sexual revolution that transformed our society and created the pornography world of free and hedonistic sensuality that we have today. But there were many, many more affected and influenced by this libertarian philosophy that could always be traced back, as they traced it back, to John Anderson. Richard Neville, Richard Walsh, Martin Sharp, who challenged censorship laws both in New South Wales and the United Kingdom with the Oz magazines. They came from the same milieu and were amongst the same people. Of course, today we're now beginning to learn something of their lives, because as they die we can tell the truth without fear of libel laws being brought against us and court cases brought against us, and because they are also looking back and saying, well, it was a bit too far, wasn't it? I mean, Richard Neville had sex with a 14-year-old girl, and Martin Sharp was also engaged with underage girls. See, the daughters of Dorothy Hewitt, two of the daughters, have come out talking about the way in which their mother, just introduced them to her friends, old men, teenage girls, which were at the disposal of her friends, growing up in this horrendous form of sexual exploitation that was not considered in any way abnormal or extreme. It's very sad, terribly sad. Interestingly, one of them mentions that the only one who ever came back and apologised was Martin Sharp, who, in a strange way that it's very hard to understand, but that's typical of Martin Sharp, came to a Christian faith later in life and was the only one who came back to these girls and apologised for having used them when they were junior teenagers. It's all so sad and tawdry. and so unsatisfying as it washed away the riverbed and created a new way of living, leaving the old behind as a slowly drying up billabong. It's recorded at depth in a book by Anne Coombs called The Life and Death of the Sydney Push. She lives in a lesbian relationship with one of the women of the Sydney Push. So it's written from a sympathetic insider's viewpoint, not from a Christian critique. Richard Walsh recently said, "The way we thought about sex was wrong. And the 60s in particular was a period of exploitation of women in different ways to what had happened in the past." This is the point of Anne Coombs' book and thesis, that the early push treated women as if they were men and abused them sexually in the process. For they believed there was nothing wrong with sex under any circumstances, any time, anywhere, anyhow, and that women should have the same view as men in this regard. The fact they had to deal with babies and abortions was their problem. But in the 1970s, the women started to meet together without the men, much to the hostility of the men, who believed that there was no sex, there was no gender, there was just the freedom of adults meeting together. And out of these meetings came the creation of feminism in the 1970s, and it was the creation of feminism which finally killed off the push. And so we come to a short history of gender. See, the push were libertarians. I mean, Germaine Greer, even to this day, is not a feminist. She's a libertarian. She believed in women's lib. The push were libertarians, but their freedom was sexual in particular, following the writings of Wilhelm Reich in particular, the disciple of Sigmund Freud, a very debauched man, I may say, as well. The philosophical character of the freedom they pursued was John Anderson's freedom of realism. And so they believed and acted that men and women were sexually the same in their right to be sexually available and active whenever they wanted and however they wanted. This turned out to be making women into men to the detriment of women who had the abortions and the baby and found sex unsatisfying and frustrating, each of them thinking that was just their problem until they started talking with each other and discovered they all had the same problem, that the men of the Sydney push were actually pigs and didn't know how to satisfy women. It was when the women got together against the push ideals that the women discovered that they had feelings beyond realism, and they created this women's lib which morphed into feminism and so came to the discussion of gender. The Oxford English Dictionary talks about the usage of this word gender because the word gender, it says, has been used since the 14th century as a grammatical term referring to classes of nouns designated as masculine, feminine and neuter in some languages. The sense denoting biological sex has also been used since the 14th century, but this did not become common until the mid-20th century. Although the words gender and sex are often used interchangeably, they have slightly different connotations. Sex tends to refer to biological differences, while gender more often refers to cultural and social differences and sometimes encompasses a broader range of identities than the binary of male and female. And so here finally we come to the unisex. For gender studies got underway seriously in the 1970s and into the 80s, out of the Sydney push women who were lecturing in the philosophy department at that time. And so it split John Anderson's philosophy department into two philosophy departments at the University of Sydney for some many years. Everything became political. Feminism was right in recognising the use and abuse of women and the horror of Genesis 3, but their diagnosis of the problem was and continues to be almost totally wrong. For now it is a detachment of gender from sex to the issues of power and control and advantage and rights. Gender studies were about power and its abuse. Men and women were to be treated the same in order to be equal and equal in treatment and opportunity. Women's reproductive processes were to be ignored in any discussion of a person's right to employment, advancement or power. Men and women are to be viewed as simply humans, no longer husband and wife, now simply partners, changing the wedding service to make the vows interchangeable. What the man promises, exactly the same as what the woman promises, because we're not marrying a man and a woman, we're marrying two people. Only by sameness can equality be expressed. But men and women are equally human together in God's image. But that unity is one of difference, the fundamental difference being that of reproduction, of sex. But associated with that difference, there are many other differences. See, here's a classic graph of standard distribution. The height of people. You know, some people are short, most people are middle height, some people are really tall. That's just standard distribution. But associated with it are many others. You see, the distribution of men and women on a single issue like height often produces two patterns. Men are taller than women. But there's an overlap because there are some men who are shorter than some women. In general, there are two populations overlapping. Some of the issues of distribution are much closer than that. Singing in tune may or may not be closer. I don't know which one we'd go for, but there are some that are much closer, there are some that are much further away. There are some in which there's an absolute difference, like having babies and breastfeeding. The men are all just incompetent in those areas, unable to do it. Now, our sexual differences combine all these and many more factors into a multifactored masculinity and femininity. For there are any number of factors in which we are different. Distribution of hair on the body, weight, distribution of muscles. There are physiological differences like this. What our cultured gender differences do is to train and accentuate these differences, sometimes harmfully, because women are feminine and femininity has to do with daintiness and wealth has to do with being servant. Some Chinese women had their feet bound so that they could never grow. Wicked, evil, awful thing to have done to cripple these poor girls. See, sometimes in order to accentuate, to get the culture of gender difference right, harmful things are done. Sometimes things that are done, I believe, are very helpful, like teaching little boys never to hit a girl. I think that's a very helpful thing to teach all little boys, which will only help us in dealing with domestic violence down the track. If every little boy knew never to raise a hand to a girl, that would be a great help in our society. Often there's a tension in working out the propriety of gender differences. Christians are not to live in the world of power and politics. Christians live in a different world. We live in the billabong of love and service, not power and politics. We believe in creation, where God made one humanity of sexual polarity in his image. We believe this creation has been distorted, partly by our sinful rebellion, partly by God's judgment, confirming our sinful rebellion. And we believe that by Christ's death and resurrection, we are new creatures who are returned to living God's way, not our way. We may have been cut off from the mainstream of society so that we are back being a billabong somewhere, but while we are small and drying up, we're still living the truth of God's world and the truth of God's word. So where to from here? Well, now that we're in the cultural billabong, what do? Firstly, trust God. His way is the best way. He knows how to make rivers and he knows how to make billabongs. He created the world, he created us, and he created us to live his way, and it's the best way to live. We've got to trust him that it will be the best. And therefore, secondly, we must stay pure. Don't change the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. Don't change the creation of God in order to join the mainstream and be with the big flowing society. Let society flow away from us, but remain faithful to God. Thirdly, we need to pray for a change. For it's only as God changes society that society will be changed in any way for the better. And so we need to pray for our society and for our fellow human beings and the pain that they're causing to each other as they charge on down the mainstream. For the good of society, we may point out their illogicality and the way in which they hurt each other, abuse each other, and use each other. And we may avoid the school social engineering. Adolescents are in such suggestible state of life as they go through their development. This is no time to be immersing them in these incredibly complex issues of their own personal identities, which they're struggling to work out for themselves anyway. This is not the time to be engaged in that, especially with the characteristic of suggestibility, even and especially from counsellors, creating problems rather than solving them. Remember 15, 20 years ago, the issue of recovered memories, where as a result of counsellors seeking to help people with recovered memories, started to actually create people with recovered memories and did much more damage than they did help. Suggestibility is a powerful force in the minds of insecure people. And to suggest to adolescents that they may be going through some form of identity on sexuality and gender is very dangerous. Furthermore, it's not the role of teachers, but parents. A teacher may see a child is in trouble, but the teacher's job is to call the parents. A teacher's job may refer to the counsellor, but the counsellor's job is to refer to the parents. The school is there on behalf of the parents. The parents are the ones responsible. And 10 years later, no school teacher will be looking after that person, no school counsellor will be looking after that person, but the parent will still be looking after the person. It's the parents who are the responsible adults in the life of adolescents, not teachers, not counsellors, not curriculum advisors from universities where the whole thing has gone amok anyway. And furthermore, I'm up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, am I? We're to help whoever wants assistance, those who are suffering in the mainstream, those who are being marginalised by the mainstream, whether by their fault or not, whether it be their sin that has created their problems or whether it be part of the judgment of God on humanity that they unfairly have received. Be it in sickness or in death, be it the sickness of the mind or socialisation or marginalisation, those struggling with same-sex attraction, those struggling with gender dysphoria, our love and concern is to help such people, not stand in judgment. Be it nature or nurture, which of course nearly always we can't work out what it is because it's both. Be it nature or nurture, we must be kind and sympathetic to people in their plight, because we do not live as individuals, though individualism is what is taught by such Andersonian philosophy. We do not live as individuals, we live as part of society. No one is just a drop. We're all a drop in the stream, and the stream is heading relentlessly on, unless you live in the billabong. Nothing moves in the billabong. And we can help those people, you see, who are struggling with the stream's hurt. But in the long run, billabongs need fresh inflow. Otherwise they dry up and just become bogs and marshes. We need fresh inflow. It is God who will refresh us, as we are his people. Do not be worried. Do not be alarmed. The history of Christianity and the history of Israel before Christianity is time after time God has brought the refreshment in his own good time as people remained faithful to his ways. And so we need to evangelise, for it's by evangelising that we bring new people in. And as we bring new people in, so the river starts to flow again through us. And we need to continue reproducing, because that is a way of keeping the billabong alive as well, as we continue to have children and raise them up to the fear and nurture of the Lord. And we need to wait and to wait for the revival that will flood our billabong and change the nature of the river. I don't know when it'll happen, but when it does happen, all kinds of things change. And so we wait for God in his mercy to change our society for the good. It may not be in my lifetime, may not be in yours, but God will never be outflanked. God will bring about his purposes in his good time, in his good way. What we're called upon to do is to remain faithful to him where we are, and faithfulness to him does not mean satisfied with being a billabong. It means reaching out to bring more people in through the preaching of the gospel, for that is the way the billabong is ultimately refreshed, humanly speaking.
Thanks, Philip. Just thinking about the idea of a billabong and letting society leave us as we hang on to the truth, and thinking about relevance and other, I maybe think of the Amish or something who've kind of maybe taken that principle too far, and understanding how we kind of think about that a little bit. Thanks.
Yes, some groups have taken it too far, like the Amish, because they got left not in the gospel, but in their cultural package of the gospel. And so they continue to speak High German that no one else spoke and things like that. And furthermore, they didn't enter into evangelism. So, two common dangers. One is you just lock yourself into a package of yesteryear. You don't have to be Amish to do that. You can be a prayer book Anglican and do it that way without evangelism, which of course is always confrontational and difficult and leads to persecution and unhappiness. The other option, of course, is you open up the other end of the billabong and you try to join up with the mainstream by becoming like them. And so at the other end, the liberal end theologically actually, is accommodationism. And so we desperately try to accept as many of the norms of the new way as we possibly can with a vague, clear conscience. But the consequence of always that is that within next to no time, we become like them, indiscernible from the rest of them, and people say, well, why go to church? What they're teaching in church is what I believe in society. I mean, what's the difference?